Today we're going to talk about Paul. We're not going to talk about his theology or his relationship with James and Peter. We're going to talk about Paul, the man, or Saul. Okay, Paul of Tarsus, where he came from. What makes Paul the very peculiar individual that he is? So, welcome. Thank you for joining us today, and let's get into it. In Acts 22:3, Paul states that he's born in Tarsus. Tarsus today is located in Turkey. At the time, it was a very elite Roman city, a lot of money, and a center for Roman culture. Okay, it's a very affluent place. So Paul was a member of the diaspora. Okay, he was a Jewish person living outside of the Holy Land. He would have spoke Greek, and he would have been very familiar with Roman traditions and culture, and even Greek traditions and culture. So there's a lot of theories as to how they got there, because Paul's a Roman citizen. And so how did that happen? Well, it happened by right of inheritance. I mean, his parents were Roman citizens. There's some debate about how that happened. I've heard some theories that his parents or his family members were taken as slaves some years prior, and under Roman law, slaves were able to work and earn their freedom, and thus their citizenship, which would have been passed down to Paul. St. Jerome, in the 4th century, is aware of a tradition that his family lived in Gishala, in what is today northern Israel, but back then was Galilee. Today it's located right next to the Golan Heights, pardon me. And during the Jewish uprising in 4 BC, his parents fled from Gishala and resettled in Tarsus, where they went on to produce the New Testament's most prolific author. He was apparently quite affluent, though, because he received the best education that a Jewish person could want in those days. Also in Acts 22:3, Paul describes that he was trained at the feet of Gamaliel. Okay, now Gamaliel was like the Stephen Hawking of his day as far as Pharisaic Judaism was concerned. So Paul was sent to Jerusalem to be educated under Gamaliel. He already would have been exposed to rhetoric and debate and whatnot, and he would take those skills now and learn the law, be educated in Pharisaic Judaism, as it were. So we have kind of a clashing of two different hemispheres here. You have his Gentile education from Roman rhetoric and Roman tradition, Greek tradition. Now he's taking that into Jerusalem, where he's going to learn from the Pharisees. He's going to learn Jewish law and Jewish theology from Gamaliel himself. And Gamaliel's brought up quite a bit with Paul because he's kind of borrowing from Gamaliel's gravitas. It would be not too dissimilar for a physicist to talk about training under Stephen Hawking or Kip Thorne. You're mentioning that I'm in that group. I learned from this man. So when he's talking to, especially debating Jewish people, he'll say, well, I was educated at the feet of Gamaliel, which meant that I was trained by him in the law or in Torah. So there's no question that Paul is a bright man, and that Paul is especially compared to the other people he's meeting, he's a well-traveled man and a well-rounded man. But he is, his personality is something else. We can tell some things from him, that he thrives on authority. Okay, so he draws from authorities greater than anyone else's. Okay, and he's very defensive about this. So when compared against the, Peter or James, or the so-called super apostles, he doesn't care what they call it. He gets his authority directly from Jesus. Okay, or he gets his knowledge of Jewish law from Gamaliel. Okay, he almost seems to the point of being, he's defensive, but he almost seems like he's constantly legitimizing himself, especially given that he is a member of the diaspora. Okay, so he's come to Jerusalem, where the temple is, and so he's basically an outsider. He's an outsider there. And yes, he's trained under Gamaliel, but he's from the provinces. He's from Rome, more or less. And so he's constantly having to legitimize himself, and we see him do this all throughout the New Testament. So with his background in rhetoric, and of course his expert knowledge in the Torah, he is authorized by Annas, who is the high priest, to go forth and basically maintain the law. So he goes out, he starts in Jerusalem and works outwards, persecuting not just Christians, not out to persecute Christians, but he's out there to uphold the law, to maintain the Torah. He was perfect for this position because of his exposure in Tarsus to Greek rhetoric. He thought in diatribe. He would anticipate objections, anticipate arguments. He knew how to structure his debates well. He knew how to apply the knowledge that he gained from Gamaliel in order to maintain the law of the land, to uphold their belief systems. And he did that quite effectively. And of course, like I say, he was centered in Jerusalem, but he would go outwards to perform his duties. Somewhere along the line, Paul bumped into some mysticism. Now, mysticism was present in Second Temple Judaism, and even part of the religion, though it was tightly controlled. It wasn't something that you would learn in your local synagogue. However, Paul happened upon it, whether it was under Gamaliel's teachings or just from being around the high priest or whatnot, or the temple. It really rubbed off on him and gives us one of the most impactful aspects of Paul's personality, which is his visions. Now, when Paul describes his visions, he's not inventing something out of nowhere. He's operating inside a Jewish world where visions, heavenly ascent, and direct access to divine knowledge already mattered. Paul talks about being taken up into the heavens, structured heavens, and receiving revelations that he says cannot be learned from other people. That assumption is important. Later, Jewish mystical texts, often grouped under what scholars called Hekkel literature, will systemize this worldview. Ascent through the heavens, restricted knowledge, and authority grounded in visionary experience. Paul does not belong to that later tradition, but he clearly belongs to the same visionary world. In that world, authority doesn't come from lineage, it doesn't come from memory, it comes from encounter. Paul's visions don't just inform him, they authorize him. And once authority comes from revelation, it no longer needs Jerusalem. So we see that Paul has several different aspects to him that all combine to give us a whole new religion that we celebrate today. Okay, he has got his foundation back in Tarsus, where he's learned Greek rhetoric and debate. They went on to Jerusalem and studied at Gamaliel, where he learned the Torah and worked under the high priest. Okay, and then had a vision in which he came to meet Jesus in that vision and converted to Christianity. And that's where his troubles began, in that getting people to listen to him. Okay, because his authority under Gamaliel wasn't enough. James has authority because James is the brother of Jesus, so people listen to James. Peter has authority because Peter was with Jesus during the ministry and there when Jesus was crucified. Paul is now the outsider Paul draws his authority from his vision in which he saw the living Christ. And he believes it fervently. And so in Paul, we see not dry rhetoric, but very emotional, argumentative, defensive action. Paul is forever legitimizing himself, or trying to, and forever fighting to establish his authority to share what he calls his gospel to the world beyond the Jewish people, to the entire Gentile world. And of course, this leads him to be in conflict with the church headed by James. Okay, and so we're going to take a look at that in the next episode. We're going to look at Paul versus the church in Jerusalem, which is probably the most exciting part about this whole series, is seeing how these two worlds collide, where Paul, the outsider, but he's being very successful in spreading what he believes to be the message of Jesus. Now, mind you, Paul doesn't know anything about Jesus aside from the vision. I'm sure he's absorbed some, but Paul never met Jesus. Paul never saw him. Paul never spoke to him. And you'll notice that when Paul's writings, he doesn't quote Jesus. He doesn't make any references to Jesus' life because he doesn't know it. As we pointed out, the authority comes from Paul's vision. So everything he knows about Jesus comes from this vision. Okay, so when competing with James and Peter, he truly is an outsider working hard to legitimize his message. Thank you for joining me and putting up with this voice. And I've had such a great time making this for you, and I look very much forward to the next episode.